Chapter 1. The wind cut across the endless expanse like a living blade, dragging with it a chill that had never known warmth. In this white wilderness, where the sun hovers low and the silence has ruled since before memory, no one expects to find traces of life, much less of history. Yet here, in one of the most hostile places on Earth, a handful of explorers stumbled upon something that did not belong. They had come seeking nothing more than data atmospheric readings, ice core samples, routine measurements for another report destined to collect dust in a forgotten archive. But instead, they uncovered a doorway. At first, it was nothing more than a sharp angle exposed by retreating ice, just another anomaly in a landscape of shifting glaciers. Yet the stone was too straight, too deliberate, carved not by nature but by hands. The team hesitated. Their instruments warned of deep fractures, of instability, of danger, but curiosity drowned caution. They cleared the snow, brushed the frost, pressed forward, and revealed what should have been impossible. Perfect steps cut into rock. A threshold carved with geometric precision. A portal into something no map, no history book, no legend had ever whispered about. When the first beam of artificial light pierced that darkness, it did not illuminate mere stone. It unveiled architecture. It revealed intention. Smooth walls descended into chambers where no human should have ever walked. And with each step, the realization grew heavier. They were not standing on a barren plateau. They were standing on the roof of a buried world. No one spoke at first. The breath fogging inside their masks seemed louder than their thoughts. The temperature was constant, unnaturally so, as if insulated from the cold above. Dustless, still, untouched by time. When one scientist knelt to touch the floor, expecting brittle rock or fragile ice, his hand met polished stone, smooth and unyielding. This place had been built to last. Built to endure more than the crushing weight of a glacier. Built, perhaps, to endure eternity itself. The implication struck them with equal parts awe and terror. If this structure was genuine, it predated every civilization known to man. Older than the pyramids, older than Göbekli Tepe, older even than the stories whispered in ancient myth. It would mean that human history was not a steady progression from darkness to light, but a shattered cycle, one that hid secrets too enormous to accept. For what they had found was not the remnant of a scattered tribe or the bones of forgotten hunters. It was a city. Their radios crackled with interference. Instruments malfunctioned. GPS coordinates shifted inexplicably. It was as if the Earth itself resisted being recorded, as though this discovery was not meant to leave the ice. Yet even through their fear, the explorers pressed deeper. Stone corridors stretched downward into silence. The further they went, the less the outside world seemed to matter. Every step became heavier, like wading into water that thickened with unseen weight. Their minds reeled with unasked questions. Who built this? Why here, in the heart of an uninhabitable wasteland? And more haunting still, what happened to them? When they reached the first chamber, the team froze in unison. Light swept across the walls and revealed carvings, symbols unlike any alphabet known to history. Not random, not decorative, but deliberate, aligned in repeating sequences across surfaces that gleamed with unnatural perfection. Some patterns reflected the beams of their flashlights in ways no stone should, scattering refracted light like mirrors. The silence of the chamber was so absolute it pressed against their ears, a silence not of emptiness, but of waiting. One of them whispered the thought none dared say aloud. This was not the ruin of something long dead. This was the shell of something preserved, something hidden deliberately beneath the ice. As they set up their equipment, each researcher felt a gnawing unease. Their training told them they were standing in a relic of the past, but instinct screamed otherwise. This place did not feel abandoned. It felt paused, as though caught in the act of existence and sealed away by forces beyond comprehension. And when they finally realized the scale of the city corridors stretching in directions their scanners could not map, chambers stacked into the depths of the glacier, the truth became undeniable. They were standing in the midst of a civilization erased from time. History teaches us that humanity is the product of steady evolution, that we emerge slowly, step by step, guided by survival and progress. But what lay frozen beneath their boots was proof of a chapter no one had written. A society that should not exist. A city perfectly hidden, preserved not by chance but by design, waiting for an age that could uncover it. And in that instant, one truth cut deeper than the wind outside. If this could remain secret for millennia, sealed beneath the most hostile climate on Earth, then what else had been hidden? What other truths buried in silence wait for us to stumble upon them? The team had come searching for weather data, but instead they had opened a fracture in history itself. And once opened, fractures never close. Chapter 2: Whispers Beneath the Glacier. Long before the team's discovery reached the surface world, there had been whispers, faint and scattered like static on an old radio. Records buried in classified archives, fragments of forgotten missions, the half-muttered stories of explorers who never returned. For decades, both governments and independent researchers had noted anomalies in these frozen frontiers, data that never fit the models, events that were quietly filed away and never spoken of again. The ice had always been a mystery, but beneath it lurked something more, something that pulsed like a hidden heartbeat waiting to be found. In the 1960s, a Soviet expedition in the Siberian permafrost reported seismic vibrations that did not resemble natural movement. They recorded deep, rhythmic pulses, too regular to be tectonic, too patterned to dismiss as coincidence. Within weeks, the project was classified, the records locked, and the site abandoned. Decades later, NATO satellite scans over Antarctica detected regions of unexpected warmth beneath miles of ice, zones where temperatures were inexplicably higher than their surroundings. Officially, the explanation was geothermal activity. Unofficially, those who saw the data swore the heat signatures formed shapes, rectangles, corridors, chambers. Not the chaos of nature, but the order of design. Even as far back as early whaling expeditions, sailors whispered of compasses that spun without reason near certain coordinates, of eerie lights shimmering below the frozen seas. The tailies were dismissed as drunken ramblings or folklore. Yet time and again the same areas were avoided, marked as cursed on old maritime charts. When modern researchers returned with better tools, their instruments suffered the same fate. Magnetic anomalies scrambled their readings, equipment failed without cause, and often, their recorded data would vanish from drives, corrupted beyond repair. But among the most haunting testimonies are the auditory phenomena. Researchers in the 1990s, using ground-penetrating radar and seismic sensors, reported hearing low-frequency murmurs beneath the ice. At first, they dismissed it as machine interference until the sounds began repeating. Not random, not chaotic, but patterned like a code or language stripped of words. Some described it as breath moving through tunnels, others as voices just beyond comprehension, speaking in cadences that no linguist could identify. What chilled them most was that the sound seemed responsive. When the team moved closer to one location, the murmurs grew louder. When they retreated, the sound faded. It was as though something below was aware of them. One of the few surviving recordings is grainy, distorted, but undeniable. A rising hum, then sudden silence, followed by a resonance so deep it rattles the chest even through speakers. Those who heard it described the effect as profoundly unsettling, not just noise but presence, an echo that carried intent. Scientists called it an acoustic anomaly. Those who were there called it a whisper, a warning, a reminder that the ice was not empty. When the modern team breached the surface decades later, they entered the same zones where those anomalies had been detected. And almost immediately, their equipment began to fail. GPS scrambled, compasses spun, digital clocks lost synchronization. Lights flickered even when fully charged. One researcher, reviewing the data, noticed a disturbing pattern. Every device lost function in intervals as if responding to an unseen rhythm. The same rhythm that had been described by the Soviets half a century before. And then came the moment that pushed the discovery into something beyond science. Inside the descending corridors, where the air grew heavy and the walls closed in, members of the team began hearing it. At first, a faint draft, like wind curling through narrow tunnels. But the sound did not change when the air was still. It moved when they moved, paused when they paused. Some dismissed it as imagination, but others heard words, distinct but indecipherable, echoing within the stone. Not an echo of their own voices, but something else, something older. They tried recording it, but every device captured only silence. The effect on the team was undeniable. Fatigue set in faster. Paranoia sharpened. Even the most rational among them admitted to the sense that they were not alone. As if the walls themselves listened. As if the ice remembered. Each step deeper into the dark felt less like exploration and more like trespass. They weren't just documenting the past. They were disturbing it. And in the hollow resonance of those whispers, one truth began to take hold. Unshakable and terrifying. Whatever had been buried here had not been forgotten. It had been silenced. And perhaps, even after millennia, it had never stopped listening. Chapter 3. Architecture of the Forgotten. The first true glimpse of the city struck them with a force no earthquake could match. The chamber opened slowly, revealed not by the force of tools but by the retreat of ice, as if time itself had been waiting for this moment. The beam of a flashlight swept across smooth black surfaces, and the explorers froze where they stood. This was no cavern, no natural hollow in the glacier. These were walls. Polished, deliberate, geometrically precise. Angles too sharp for erosion, symmetry too perfect for chance. Nature had not built this. Someone had. The corridors stretched outward in both directions, vanishing into darkness. Its proportions were unnerving, too tall, too narrow, shaped not for human comfort but for some other logic. Every surface bore faint engravings, invisible until light struck them at the right angle, at which point they shimmered like reflections on water. Patterns repeated endlessly, curling in fractals that seemed to shift as the explorers moved, as though the walls themselves carried memory. The more they looked, the less sense it made. This was not decoration. It was design, code, a language carved into stone, waiting to be read. What unsettled them most was the state of preservation. Under the crushing weight of ice and time, the walls should have collapsed, eroded, shattered. Instead, they gleamed with the resilience of materials unknown to any modern catalog. Tests later would reveal surfaces harder than granite, resistant to acid, impervious to flame. Even laser scans failed to penetrate fully, as if the material rejected intrusion. Whoever built this place had known durability beyond anything the modern world could replicate. They had not been constructing for decades or centuries. They had been constructing for eternity. As the team advanced, they encountered structures more complex, more impossible. Staircases spiraled upward into nothingness, disappearing into ceilings sealed by ice. Doorways opened into chambers so vast they echoed like cathedrals, their ceilings dotted with crystalline formations that glittered like stars. One chamber, perfectly circular, bore a ceiling that replicated a constellation map, not of our present sky, but of an alignment that had not existed for tens of thousands of years. Another chamber's walls pulsed faintly when touched, as though conducting energy, humming at a frequency just below hearing. One scientist withdrew his hand in shock, insisting he felt movement beneath the surface like the slow heartbeat of stone. What purpose had these halls served? They were not crude shelters, nor places of worship, nor simple homes. Everything about their construction spoke of intention, of function. But the function remained elusive. The chambers were laid out in spirals, not grids, as though the city had been designed not to expand outward, but to fold inward, deeper into itself. The architecture was less like a settlement and more like a machine, a living mechanism carved into ice and stone, a structure that might have had purpose long after its builders were gone. And yet, the deeper they went, the more disturbing the silence became. No debris littered the floors. No broken tools, no remnants of food or fire. No signs of struggle, no indications of abandonment. The city was intact but empty, preserved in a state too perfect to be natural. It did not feel like a ruin, and it did not feel ancient. It felt paused, as though life had simply stopped, and the structures had waited patiently for someone to arrive. Some among the team began whispering theories, each more unsettling than the last. Perhaps the city had never been abandoned at all. Perhaps it had been hidden, buried deliberately, sealed beneath ice to protect it from something, or to protect the world from it. Architects who later reviewed the footage admitted the design defied categorization. It bore no resemblance to Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Mesoamerican, or any other known style. Engineers confessed that many of its features could not have been built even with today's technology, not under such conditions, not with such precision. Every expert who touched the data came to the same conclusion, spoken with dread. This place doesn't belong here. It wasn't just that it was too old. It was that it was impossible. A puzzle with no edges, a monument to knowledge no one was supposed to possess. And in that moment, as the explorers stood within chambers that defied explanation, the realization settled like a weight none of them could shake. If this was real and every test confirmed it was, then history as we know it is a lie. For what they had found beneath the glacier was not merely a city. It was evidence of a civilization erased, a chapter torn from humanity's story, hidden where no one would dare look. The architecture of the forgotten had been unearthed, and it had not been meant to see the light again. Chapter 4. The sealed archway yielded with a sound like stone remembering its own weight, and the beam of a headlamp swept across faces that should have belonged to the living, not skeletons, not wrapped relics. Bodies with color in the lips and texture in the skin, with hair that caught the light and eyes that held a faint glassy sheen. A man knelt with his hands loosely clasped, not in terror but in focus. A woman leaned forward as if offering something to a child. The child's mouth was curved in a small, unguarded smile. There were no signs of struggle, no claw marks on the walls, no posture of flight. Time had not eroded them. Time had stepped aside. The air inside that chamber defied the laws the team carried in their training. The temperature held steady beyond the calibration of their sensors, neither rising with body heat nor falling with the opening of the seal. Frost formed on their equipment yet refused to settle on the skin of the preserved. The floor registered dry to the touch while humidity readings insisted on saturation. A faint, rhythmic resonance vibrated through the stone. Barely audible, a pressure more than a sound that made speech falter and watch hands drift. The deeper they recorded, the more their instruments disagreed with one another, as if measurement itself had lost meaning. Clothing intact. Fibers unlike any cataloged weave, smooth under the glove but impossibly strong. A subtle pattern repeated along hems and cuffs, not decorative, more like a signature of function, perhaps a conductive path. The man's sleeve bore a narrow band of metal with a finish that did not tarnish under oxygen exposure. The woman's belt carried a small container sealed with an interference fit so precise that a blade could not find a seam. The child held an object the size of a large coin, etched with intersecting arcs. When lifted from the hand, it felt warmer than the air, and after minutes in a sample pouch, it returned to the exact temperature of the chamber without transition. As if obeying a rule the explorers did not know. Carbon dating failed on contact. Collagen samples returned values that mapped to no meaningful timeline. Radiometric baselines wandered, then collapsed. DNA sequencing gave partial answers that raised larger questions. The genome read as human, yet markers appeared where none should be, silent variations that suggested adaptation without precedent. Mitochondrial signatures resisted classification. One geneticist wrote in her log that the code felt familiar in the way a word on the tip of the tongue feels familiar, recognizable yet unreachable. Another compared certain sequences to known ancient populations, finding echoes without lineage, like reflections without a source. Medical examination through non-invasive imaging found no crystal damage in soft tissues, no ruptured cells, no trauma consistent with freezing. It looked less like cold storage and more like vitrification, a halting of motion at the smallest scale, a glass state maintained without the brittleness of glass. Corneas were clear. Capillaries were intact. The faintest residue of oils remained on skin, unoxidized. No bacterial growth. No fungal colonization. Life paused without rot, death without decay, suspension without ice burns or fractures. If it was a natural process, it had exploited physics that modern laboratories cannot sustain outside a narrow window. If it was engineered, it had been perfected by minds that treated time the way we treat temperature. Every attempt to breach the environment met an answer. Needles dulled against tissue that should have been soft. Scalpel edges skated without bite. Even the sample swab returned pristine. It was as if an invisible membrane protected the bodies, a boundary that allowed observation but refused penetration. When a researcher lowered a conductive probe toward the band at the man's wrist, the chamber's resonance shifted by a fraction of a hertz and the probe's reading flatlined. The team pulled back, not from orders but from instinct. They were trespassing on something that felt prepared, a stage set for witnesses who would not be allowed to interfere. Anthropologists read posture as language. These postures spoke of intention, not catastrophe. The man's hands rested in a gesture of completion, not fear. The woman's torso angled toward the child with the calm of instruction, not alarm. The child's unguarded smile was the cruelest detail of all. No one smiles in the second before disaster unless there is no second. Whatever came upon them came without warning and without pain. It was instantaneous or it was chosen. Those are the only options the scene would allow. Small details accumulated until they formed a pattern the mind could not dismiss. The walls behind the bodies bore faint scoring, the same intersecting arcs etched into the child's disc. A narrow groove in the floor sat exactly where the man's knee rested, as if he had knelt there often. The woman's container, once opened with a magnetic key the team did not possess, would likely reveal nothing loose or fragile. The chamber was not a trap and not a tomb. It had the discipline of a ritual and the polish of a technology. The two are not mutually exclusive when a culture understands both necessity and meaning. Ethics entered the room like a second team. Voices lowered. Checklists lengthened. The explorers were trained to extract, to test, to catalog. Standing within that pause, they became caretakers against their will. They took measurements at a distance. They mapped the chamber in arcs and chords. They recorded breath they did not believe was there. The longer they remained, the more the resonance sank into the sternum and the more their clocks drifted out of sync. When they stepped back across the threshold, the drift corrected, as if the chamber held a time of its own. Fairies rose and fell on a tide of caution. Perhaps this was a sanctuary prepared for a threat that arrived too quickly. Perhaps it was a quarantine for a contagion that never breached. Perhaps it was neither survival nor containment, but communication. A message composed not in words but in bodies arranged with meaning. A tableau meant to be found by minds prepared to ask the right questions. If so, then the child's smile was not a cruelty. It was an instruction to look without panic and to read with patience. One more pattern waited in the background, easy to miss until seen, impossible to ignore once noticed. The hairlines of the three aligned with a faint seam in the stone, a seam that continued beyond the archway into an adjoining chamber where the walls carried symbols cut so fine they felt painted by pressure rather than blade. The team had been drawn first to faces because faces command attention. The builders had intended the eyes to lead to the seam and the seam to lead to the writing. The bodies were not the end of a story. They were a doorway to the next. Chapter 5. The adjoining chamber opened with a hiss of air that had not moved in millennia. At first glance it appeared barren, its walls smooth and unbroken, but when the explorers adjusted their lights, the surfaces began to shimmer. Carvings emerged, delicate and intricate, lines so fine they seemed woven into the stone itself. This was no decoration. It was information, encoded in forms that hovered between art and mathematics, diagrams that compelled the eye to follow their rhythm even when the mind could not decipher them. It was as though language had been stripped to its essence, freed from the burden of words and rebuilt as pure geometry. One figure dominated the far wall. A spiral, precise and flawless, with points marked along its curve like stars charted across a night sky. The points aligned with astronomical positions, though not with the sky as it appears today. When compared to known celestial maps, the arrangement matched a configuration the Earth had not seen for over 20,000 years. Another carving revealed what could only be the planet itself, unmistakable in its contours, yet disquietingly altered. Continents stretched in unfamiliar directions. Coastlines extended where ocean lies today, and seas covered lands we walk upon now. This was Earth, but not the Earth we know. It was the Earth of another age, a memory carved in stone and hidden in ice. At the heart of these engravings was a fracture, a jagged line that split the surface representation of the planet in two, radiating outward like a scar. Symbols clustered around the break, repeating with relentless consistency. Some curved inward like collapsing waves, others spiraled outward like an expanding shock. The explorers named it the fracture, though some whispered another phrase when the lights dimmed: the moment of break, the point at which their world had ended or transformed into something unrecognizable. Was it a warning carved by survivors or a prophecy left by those who foresaw their fate? Everywhere the same icon recurred. An hourglass with its center shattered, its sands spilling sideways instead of falling. It appeared on every wall, in every sequence, hidden in the details of larger diagrams. To the untrained eye it was nothing more than a pattern, but to the explorers it became an obsession. It was not time measured, it was time interrupted. A record of continuity broken, a cycle snapped apart. One of the scientists traced the symbol with his glove and whispered that it looked less like an hourglass and more like a warning against time itself. As if the builders had discovered a moment so violent, so final, that even time could not pass through it unchanged. What unsettled them most was the way the engravings reacted to light. Under the beam of their lamps, the carvings refracted with a strange luminescence, glowing faintly as though the stone itself carried memory. Under ultraviolet, hidden layers emerged, overlays of the same diagrams but shifted, altered as if presenting multiple possibilities. The Earth fractured in different ways, continents falling in different directions. One layer showed seas consuming entire regions, another depicted mountains rising where plains had once stretched. It was less a record of what happened and more a library of outcomes, an archive of futures. Which one, if any, had come to pass? The deeper they moved into the chamber, the more overwhelming the patterns became. The walls curved inward, forcing them to stand at the center where every carving converged, every line and symbol angled toward the same point. When they did, their equipment faltered again. Audio recorders picked up tones too low for human hearing, pulsing at regular intervals. Electromagnetic sensors spiked, readings surging and collapsing with each pulse. It was as though the chamber had been designed to awaken only when observed from that exact position, as if its message required a witness. The explorers had not just discovered a record, they had triggered it. Interpretation divided them. Some insisted these were warnings left behind by a civilization that had predicted their own destruction, an attempt to preserve memory beyond catastrophe. Others believed it was less a warning and more a message to the future, a communication across epochs to those who would one day face the same threat. A few, shaken and sleepless, argued something darker, that the engravings were not records of past events but instructions, that the builders had encoded not a memory but a mechanism. When they emerged back into the previous chamber, their silence was heavier than before. Each carried the same realization, though none spoke it aloud. What lay beneath the glacier was not merely a city preserved in time. It was a story carved into stone, a story of cycles and fractures, of worlds that rise and worlds that fall. And standing among those frozen bodies, staring at symbols that glowed with impossible light, the explorers felt the weight of a truth that pressed harder than the ice above their heads. The catastrophe recorded in those walls was not the end of their civilization. It was the warning of an event that could come again.